What is the domain, truly? Why exactly did the Precursors build it? Is there actually a grand theory that could explain nearly everything in Halo's lore? The Halo universe has become quite expansive, and as it has expanded, the mysteries surrounding its lore have as well. But at the end of the day, Halo is a fictional universe that was created by real people. In the case of Halo, author Greg Bear is responsible for writing 3 Halo books that have given rise to most of Halo's biggest mysteries. Greg Bear's Halo books, Cryptum, Primordium, and Silentium, all expanded and laid the foundation for Halo's story both inside of and outside of the actual games. This is Sean W., and this is the first installment of my new series, The Lore Behind the Lore, where we get into the minds of the creators of our favorite universes to help us unlock the secrets that are hiding in plain sight. I will now bring you on a tour of what I have found after spending months analyzing all of Greg Bear's novels and the massive discussion board on his website, where he has been answering fans' questions for over a decade. We are about to decode Halo's biggest secrets, basically by using an outside-the-box approach to Halo's lore. Welcome to part 1 of the lore behind Halo's lore. This is going to be a 2-part series, and it will be very analytical, so I figured I'd give you this roadmap real quick before we start. What I can promise you is that there is a mind-blowing moment waiting for you when you make it to the end of part 1 here. First, we will quickly recap the relevant lore you need to know for this video. Then, I will show you some information about Greg Bear and how it has influenced what he put into Halo's lore. Then, we will examine some major science fiction concepts that I was able to fully confirm Greg Bear subscribes to. And then we're going to use that to see how it directly influenced many of the things in the lore, such as the domain and the precursors. And then finally, I will show you how I combined all the concepts Greg Bear put into Halo's lore into one grand theory that might just be exactly what he was thinking when he wrote his 3 Halo books. You will of course have to judge that for yourself. This theory answers, with evidence, what the overarching story of Halo is, what the domain is, what created the precursors, and what their purpose was. In part 2, which is a separate video, we will apply the theory to some of the biggest mysteries in the lore, such as what in the world is Cortana up to in Halo 5? Real quick before we begin, if you end up enjoying this video, be sure to toast that sub button and drop a like on this vid. It really means a lot to me, and it really helps me to keep going with the channel. Also, I'm happy to announce and invite you to come check out my new social media site, Level Chat. Level Chat is basically a social media platform and a video game combined into one. Everything you do on Level Chat earns you experience, which increases your level. As your level goes up, you gain coins and gems and access to all kinds of things. Unlike other social media platforms, this is only about gaming. So come share your content on Level Chat's content feed, and you will probably get way more viewers on your content, honestly, than on every other big platform, where it's harder than ever to be heard through all the noise. There's a lot more to Level Chat, but a link is in the description if you're interested, and yes, it is totally free. So there's a ton of lore outside the Halo games, and it's contained in over 20 different Halo books. Giving you even 20% of the lore outside the games would take hours, so I can't possibly summarize all the lore in a matter of minutes, but what I can do is give you enough of the lore that is relevant to this video, so you can still enjoy everything here, even if you don't have much previous knowledge. Lore experts, know that I am aware I'm leaving many things out. This is intentional, both because those things are just not needed for this video, and to kind of create a middle ground, right? So this section here isn't an hour long or something like that. So the Halo story essentially begins with the Precursors, which are the oldest known advanced beings in the lore. Knowledge on them is very limited, which makes them super mysterious. They are described as being transient beings that could shapeshift and take on pretty much any form they wanted. They had the most advanced technology in the universe, such as star roads and something called the domain. Star roads were like giant super advanced cables that linked planets and star systems together and allowed these precursors to travel around space very quickly. The domain was essentially a self-aware and mysterious library of knowledge that existed in an alternate plane of reality and could be accessed pretty much anywhere in the galaxy. The lore on this gets super complicated really fast, But if you've never heard of the domain before, think of it as like a self-aware data server that can be accessed over the internet. The Precursors seeded life all across the universe, and they had their own belief system, which is basically that the universe is alive and that the experience of all life was valuable knowledge. That's why they created the domain, to have a place to store all of their knowledge. The Precursors also had a belief in the mantle, which was that there should be a species that looks over all other species. They gave the mantle to one of their creations, the Forerunners, the same ones from the games, alright? And then the Precursors peacefully disappeared from the galaxy. The Forerunners then ruled the galaxy for millions of years, and eventually they encountered ancient humans who had also been created by the Precursors. The Forerunners went to war with our ancient ancestors, and they did beat us. And then they devolved us. After defeating us though, the Forerunners discovered the Flood for the first time. At this point in the lore, there's a bit of a twist. The twist is basically that the Precursors did not peacefully disappear. They were all but destroyed by the Forerunners. But it goes even deeper than that. Before being destroyed by the Forerunners, some of the Precursors shapeshifted into a dust, with the goal of eventually reforming themselves in the future. So basically these Precursors transform themselves into like freeze-dried powder. Over time though, this powder became corrupted. Ancient humans basically found the powder by accident and gave it to their pets. Yes, I'm being serious. The genetics in the powder led to mutations in the humans' pets that eventually created the Flood. Ancient humans began battling the Flood, and in their attempts to stop the Flood, they basically started a war with the Forerunners. So ancient humans were just trying to defeat the Flood, but the Forerunners didn't know that. The Forerunners began battling the Flood and managed to get the Flood to retreat. They knew the Flood would eventually come back though, which led them to creating the Halo Rings. To manage the Halo Rings, they created an AI called Mendicant Bias. Eventually the Flood did return, and so the Forerunners sent out this AI, Mendicant Bias, to go test fire the Halo Rings. The AI test fired one of the rings on an old Precursor world called Sharum Hakor that happened to still have one last Precursor on it, and he was held in a stasis chamber. Firing the Halo Ring freed this being called the Primordial. The Forerunners took the Primordial captive and then ordered the AI Mendicant Bias to study it. The Primordial then used something called the Logic Plague against the AI, which was basically a way to get Mendicant Bias to switch sides against the Forerunners. Mendicant Bias then helped the Primordial in the Flood wage war with the Forerunners. During this war, the Forerunners managed to capture the Primordial, which revealed the truth about the Flood, which was that the Flood were just basically a version of the Precursors, and they wanted revenge on the Forerunners. The Forerunners managed to kill the Primordial, but it didn't matter because the Primordial managed to join its conscious with the Flood's constantly growing hive mind. Ultimately, the Forerunners were forced to fire the Halo Rings in order to defeat the Flood, and most of them, along with most other life as well, were wiped out. The galaxy went relatively quiet, and life started to re-emerge and evolve again, which leads to the events of the Halo games. So that's a brief summary of the lore up until the Halo games. For the sake of time, I will assume that you know the basics from the games, alright? Which is all you need to know for this particular video. Alright, so with that summary out of the way, let's really get started here. So Greg Bear is as successful as a writer as you will find, with a large body of work and numerous awards. He was perfect for working on the Halo series because many of the science fiction concepts he subscribes to are fully compatible with the Halo universe. One of his books, for example, Blood Music, is heavily themed around the Grey Goo hypothetical, which is super similar to the Flood. The Grey Goo hypothetical deals with the idea of nanotechnology going out of control and beginning to self-replicate by consuming any mass it can find on Earth and using that material to build more of themselves. Sounds pretty close to the Flood. Greg Bear has openly stated that he is a theist, which is essentially the belief that there is some kind of god or gods out there, but without the belief system of any specific religion. The other important thing about theism is that on a general level, all theists believe that God or gods created the entire universe and are responsible for everything in existence. There are many types of theism, but there is really only one type of theism that fits with Greg Bear's own public statements on God. In addition, modern-day theists like Greg Bear, who essentially combine science with philosophy and religion, are all mainly one type of theist. Greg Bear gave a great example of his theism on his discussion board when he replied to someone who left a comment about evolution and God. Greg Bear said, "God's plan touches on a lot of hot-button issues today. The best way I can express it is that I think of the laws and constants discovered by science as God's fingers. Not evidence of divinity, but divinity itself." Panentheism most closely matches Greg Bear's statements. His statements are also very close to pantheism. Discussing the difference between the two can get real complicated real fast, but the basic distinction is that pantheism is the belief that reality itself is God, and literally everything is God. Panentheism is different from this because it's more the belief that God is behind everything and is a higher background force above everything. So basically, in panentheism, not everything is God, whereas in pantheism, literally everything is God. You can see how this gets pretty complicated pretty fast. But in any event, Greg Bear explaining that he thinks scientific laws, for example, are God's fingers, is an exact match of the panentheism belief system. We see the best example of Greg Bear's theism in Halo in the concept of neural physics that he introduced for the first time into the Halo universe in Halo Cryptum. Neural physics in Halo is textbook panentheism. Halopedia has a great description of neural physics in Halo, and it reads, "Neural physics was a precursor concept in science which posited that the mantle encompassed the entire universe, including living beings, energy, and matter. The principles of neural physics also postulated that the entire universe was living, but in a way that was beyond the comprehension of biological organisms." The concept of neural physics matches the main principles behind panentheism because it is a belief by the Precursors that the universe has a higher power and purpose behind it. We see this confirmed, for example, in what an ancient forerunner named Bornsteller himself says in Halo Cryptum when he says, "Precursors felt the mantle extended to the entire universe, energy and matter as well as living creatures. The universe lives, but not as we do." Calling the universe living takes direct inspiration from theism, which is to be expected since Greg Bear is a theist. Using theism essentially as a framework and base for expanding Halo's lore is simply just smart writing. Coming up with a fictional universe is difficult because you have to make sure everything makes sense. Most of the best fictional universes have some kind of foundation, in something that's familiar. Take Harry Potter, for example. We've all been to school before, so even though Hogwarts is a magical school, we can still understand it because it's a familiar concept. Theism works great because even if you don't believe in God and you're an atheist, you have at least contemplated the concept of God and God being the creator of the universe. Star Wars is yet another example of this with the Force. Again, you can be a complete atheist but still understand the concept of the Force. It's familiar. So Greg Bear's theism is the most important personal detail about him in our quest to understand the lore behind Halo's lore. Now let's move on to some of the scientific and philosophical concepts that Greg Bear subscribes to, so we can see their influence on Halo's lore and thus help us decode the lore. So these are some of the big concepts that I was able to confirm Greg Bear is quite knowledgeable about. As a top science fiction author, it would be impossible for him to not be aware of any of these anyway. The first concept is evolution, which is a major theme in Greg Bear's Halo books, from the Flood to the Precursors and the Forerunners. I think the influence of evolution in the general sense is pretty obvious in the books, but what is not so obvious are Bear's exact beliefs on evolution, okay? This is necessary to understand what is going on in the background and underneath a lot of things in these novels. Greg Bear fully subscribes to an ever-growing theory and philosophy that many of the top minds in society are beginning to subscribe to in regards to evolution. Before I get into this, I'll try to issue a warning here. I am not trying to convince you of anything on evolution, alright? I am not explaining my own personal thoughts on evolution. I am simply explaining Greg Bear's views on evolution, so we can take his views and decode how they influence his Halo books. So without overcomplicating it, the growing belief on evolution is based on questioning the reasons and mechanisms behind evolution. We are not talking about a denial of evolution, but more of an expansion into the understanding of the why of it. We can see evidence for evolution in the fossil record, but one of the big questions surrounding evolution from thinkers like Greg Bear is, why does the evolution seem to only happen in one direction? Darwin, who started the science of evolution, explained that evolution is driven by natural selection, which occurs through random mutations in an organism that can be passed on if they are useful. This is like what we're all taught in school, right? The question that many modern day thinkers like Greg Bear ask is, why does all the evidence show that the mutations behind natural selection don't seem to be all that random? The evidence, especially the fossil record, seems to show organisms consistently moving from simple creatures, especially at the start of the record, to more advanced creatures. We humans are the prime example. We are the most intelligent creatures to have ever lived on Earth, without question. So again, the question is, if life keeps moving from simple to complex, how is that random? If it was truly random, then why do we never see complex creatures sometimes move from complex to simple? Again, these are just the questions they ask, all right? Not my beliefs. One more example of what thinkers like Greg Bear wonder is the question of, why are there nearly no examples in the modern world of the type of mutations that will continue to drive evolution in the future? Darwin himself actually struggled with this and once asked, why do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined? So I think you get the picture here, right? Now, here's a quote from Greg Bear's discussion board that shows his thoughts on evolution. You may have noticed that I'm not a hardliner on some evolutionary principles, such as random variation. So the important takeaway here is that Greg Bear basically combines his belief in theism with evolution, and believes that while evolution is real, perhaps it is not random and has divine force behind it. Because, like we saw before, he believes science is literally the study of God's fingers. More on this later though. The evidence for a higher purpose behind evolution rather than randomness is seen all over the place in Greg Bear's Halo novels. We almost barely even need to touch on it. The Precursors themselves are said to have the power to accelerate evolution, which makes it not random, right? For Thencho, an ancient human literally said the Precursors evolved over and over again. The Forerunner evolved through mutations to more advanced forms, while also overseeing the evolution and even the de-evolution of other species. Even the flood evolves into an ever more advanced conscious, right? The origin story that Bear created for the flood is a great example of evolution with a purpose. The flood definitely had a higher purpose behind their evolution, and it was not completely random. What's significant is that Greg Bear clearly applies the concept of evolution with a purpose to the many examples of evolution in his Halo books. Next important, and one of the most fun things about the way Greg Bear writes and creates stories, is that he tries to infuse real things from real life into the stories. This helps a lot with like the suspension of disbelief, because it makes the story more familiar and easier to understand. Halo already does this, but Bear certainly expanded on it. What I found fun and interesting is that Greg Bear expanded on the concept of the Big Bang being a part of Halo's timeline. In the Halo 3 terminals, the AI named Mendicant Bias talks to the Primordial, who says at one point, "Our appearance ushered in the beginning of the third great stage of evolution. The first condensation of particles was the result of the inevitable action of strong nuclear force and the creation of stars. Inevitable action of gravity, so to the self-replicating chemical processes that dictate all disparate. In addition, we too shall effect change on a universal scale." This is a basic description of the events that followed the Big Bang, right? Which confirms without a doubt that the Big Bang is part of Halo's lore. For Thencho, basically one of the most intelligent and powerful ancient humans in these books, also confirmed the Big Bang in Halo Silentium when he said, "The Gravemind tells us something impossible to understand, that most of what has been gathered comes from before there were stars." Greg Bear was given a lot of creative freedom to create his Halo books, but for sure he still respected and worked within the existing lore. Halo Cryptum and Silentium say that precursor technology is billions of years old. Therefore, the precursors are also billions of years old, but they came into existence sometime after the Big Bang, just as the primordial literally says in the Halo 3 terminal. This timeline roughly matches with what we think in 2020, which is that the universe is about 14 billion years old, right? And it's just another example of Greg Bear using our current understanding of science wherever possible. The final important concept that Greg Bear injected into Halo's lore is the global brain hypothesis, which has become quite a popular concept. The global brain hypothesis is relatively simple and something I bet many of you have heard of and probably even thought of on your own in some form. The hypothesis is that as the world becomes more and more connected, the more it resembles a massive decentralized brain that encompasses all of Earth. Howard Bloom has written one of the best books on this subject, titled Global Brain, The Evolution of Mass Mind, from the Big Bang to the 21st Century. I bring Howard Bloom's work up specifically as an example because Greg Bear has not only confirmed he is aware of Bloom's work on multiple occasions, but has also been literally confirmed to have drawn inspiration from Bloom. On his blog, Greg Bear was asked about Howard Bloom's Global Brain book, to which he responded, "Howard's work I'm familiar with." It can be a bit hard to track down actually, but also deep on Bear's website is confirmation that he did indeed draw inspiration from Bloom's work. And Greg Bear is also listed as being inspired by Howard Bloom on Bloom's official Wikipedia page. The most important takeaway from Howard Bloom's book, for our purposes, is the observation that the internet resembling a mass mind is not the only example of an ever-growing learning machine. Bloom shows in his book that the first life and microorganisms on Earth organized themselves and functioned as a mass mind, just on a relatively smaller scale. So what does this mean? If you look at most of the evolution on Earth, you can see like an ever-growing and advancing mass mind. As life evolves, it does pass on knowledge in the form of things like DNA and instincts. As life advances, the mass mind becomes more powerful, which has led to our species and the creation of the internet. We see this mass mind concept for sure in Greg Bear's Halo books, with the domain and other precursor technology, such as the Star Roads. The Precursors' most advanced technology serve the purpose of categorizing knowledge into the domain, which is essentially an ever-growing conscious. In Halo Primordium on pages 234 and 235, the domain is confirmed to be some kind of self-aware entity. But to all of us, there is a time like this when the domain seeks to confirm our essences, and for you, that time is now. The Precursor Star Roads are like neural pathways that allowed them to more quickly move about the galaxy and more quickly gather knowledge and store it in the domain. It's just like the internet with faster connection speeds. Considering that we know for an absolute fact that Greg Bear is inspired by Howard Bloom's work, the domain and precursor technology matching mass mind theories is obviously not a coincidence. It's simply Greg Bear drawing inspiration from a widely accepted and legitimately fun science fiction concept. So there are many other sci-fi concepts that Greg Bear believes in, and you can see how he weaved them into Halo's lore, but those are for future videos. I wanted to stick with the most grand and explosive stuff for this video. I have to clarify and say that up until this point, I have aimed to give you just the facts about Greg Bear and Halo's lore, but now I will combine them into the best theory I could come up with that mixes all of these major concepts together. I basically consider this a grand theory for Halo. So then, it's finally time for the twist. So what happens when you combine the clear theism, evolutionary, and mass mind concepts in Halo's lore all together? Well, just like we went over with Greg Bear's knowledge of mass minds, it's pretty clear that the precursors were building a mass mind and conscious. The domain is an ever-growing conscious which absorbs and stores information in a living conscious state. This is nothing less than a mass conscious mind slowly becoming more advanced and assimilating everything given to it. But I ask, why were the precursors doing all of this and building a mass mind? This is where Greg Bear's beliefs on the purpose behind evolution comes in. Asking why the Precursors built the domain and were working to fill the domain is also a question of what drove the Precursors to evolve into beings that then kept evolving their technology for the main purpose of building the domain. Well, it goes back to the concept of neurophysics that Greg Bear created, which, like we went over earlier, is based on the unique version of theism, panentheism, which is the belief of a higher force behind everything. Again, Bornsteller summed up the Precursors' beliefs in Halo Cryptum when he said, Precursors felt the mantle extended to the entire universe, energy and matter as well as living creatures. The universe lives, but not as we do. So basically, Greg Bear gave evolution a higher purpose in Halo, which is that it is driven by a living universe. The higher force behind the Precursors' evolution and the building of the domain is the living universe itself. So in other words, in Halo, the universe was the underlying force that drove the Precursors to build a mass mind. The universe in Halo is trying to build a mass mind, an all-powerful, higher conscious with absolute knowledge, because the universe is attempting to rebuild itself. We know the universe is trying to rebuild itself because what it once was must have been destroyed in the Big Bang. Even in modern science, we speculate that the Big Bang could have been both a beginning and an endpoint. What if before the universe in Halo was destroyed in the Big Bang, it was some kind of transient mind of unimaginable power? Well, Forthencho basically confirmed this in Halo Silentium when he said, the grave mind tells us something impossible to understand, that most of what has been gathered comes from before there were stars. We do not believe in such a time, but the mind insists. It's not that impossible to understand if there was a conscious of unimaginable power before the universe, or before there were stars, as Forthencho puts it, and it had unimaginable knowledge. Again, as Forthencho puts it, most of what has been gathered comes from before. Remember that mendicant bias is told by the primordial. Our appearance ushered in the beginning of the third great stage of evolution. And in time, we too shall effect change on a universal scale. The last stage of evolution is the universal scale recombination of the universe, back into the unimaginably powerful mind that existed before the Big Bang. Which begs the question, what caused the Big Bang? What caused the mind of the universe to be destroyed? Now, it gets dark, because as we know, the Halo universe is filled with darkness, such as the Flood, such as the Halo rings themselves, which are essentially suicide machines, evidenced by what they did to the Forerunners after they activated them. If the universe is rebuilding its mind, then everything in the universe is at least similar to what the universe was before it was destroyed. When you rebuild something, you are following a guide that existed in the past. The mind the Precursors began rebuilding with the domain was a mind filled with knowledge. The mind of the universe seeks and requires absolute knowledge. Let's assume for a moment that either the Flood or the Precursors achieve their ultimate goals, which are basically mirrors of each other. The Flood saw an assimilation of all life and knowledge into one conscious grave mind that in Primordium said, in the end, all will be quiet with wisdom. And in 101,000 centuries, unity again and wisdom. The Precursors sought absolute knowledge and transcendence, which is why they created and were filling the domain. If either of these two achieved their end goals, what would be the one thing they could not know after absorbing all knowledge in the universe? Logically, there is only one thing. It's the same piece of knowledge that would also have been unknowable to a pre-universe mind of unimaginable knowledge. The Big Bang was the universe destroying itself. It destroyed itself in the search of knowledge. If the universe destroyed itself, wouldn't its main goal be to rebuild its mind? That's why the Precursors' most advanced technology was the domain, a rebuilding of the mind of the universe. It was said that the primordial caused some ancient humans to kill themselves with something it told them. Perhaps it told them the darkest secret of all, that God was once real, but even God no longer wanted to exist. Alright, so that wraps up part 1 of this first installment of the lore behind Halo's lore. If you enjoyed, I hope you will toast that sub button because there is for sure more to come. Let me know what you think of the theory in the comments, which is essentially that the universe in Halo destroyed itself because it wanted to know what would happen and expand its knowledge. I'll see you in part 2, where I will explain more about this theory, and then I'll show you how it does fit with a lot of the lore's biggest mysteries. Also, be sure to check out Level Chat. Again, Level Chat is a fun social media site and video game in one, and it's free. You can learn more by clicking the link in the description. But hey, that's all I've got for now, so I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.